The narrator arrived at the village just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the distant hills, casting the sky in a soft, muted orange that seemed almost unreal, like a painted backdrop stretched across the horizon. The road leading into the village was narrow and uneven, cutting through stretches of open land that looked long abandoned, with wild grasses swaying lazily in the evening breeze. Each step crunched against the dirt and small stones, the sound unusually loud in the still air, as though the world itself were holding its breath. From a distance, the village appeared small but well kept. Stone houses lined the street, their walls weathered but sturdy, windows glowing with a gentle, inviting light. Smoke spiraled lazily from a few chimneys, drifting upward and merging with the dimming sky. There were no signs marking the village, no carved wooden boards, no welcoming gestures, nothing to announce its presence to travelers. It felt as if the village had been waiting here for centuries, silently watching the roads leading to it. And now, as the narrator approached, it had noticed him too. Every instinct in his body told him that something about the calmness of this place was too deliberate, too perfectly arranged. Yet he could not yet say why it made the air feel heavier, pressing softly against his chest. As the narrator walked further into the village, the first subtle signs that something was not quite right began to make themselves known. People moved about calmly, their actions precise and deliberate, yet there was an unnatural perfection to every movement. A woman carrying a basket of folded cloth crossed the street with careful, measured steps, her posture unyielding, her face composed and unblinking, showing not the slightest trace of fatigue or distraction. A man leaned against a doorway, adjusting a small object with meticulous attention, his gaze distant yet strangely aware, as if he could see everything and nothing at once. Children sat quietly on a low stone wall, whispering to one another in voices so soft they barely stirred the air, their laughter perfectly measured, never rising or falling, almost as if it had been practiced. The narrator noticed that no one yawned, no shoulders slumped, no eyelids drooped, not even for a moment. Every figure seemed to move in perfect harmony with a rhythm that existed only in the village, a rhythm the narrator could not feel or understand. The stillness of the air was different too. It carried a weight, pressing against the skin, settling into the bones, subtle enough to almost be ignored, but insistent enough to make the heart beat a little faster. Even the wind seemed hesitant, moving only when the village allowed it, brushing against leaves and grasses with the faintest of whispers, never loud enough to break the quiet. Every instinct in the narrator's body signaled that this place was not ordinary, that everything here had been arranged to appear normal while concealing a strange, silent purpose. And though the sun had set fully, bathing the village in a gentle twilight, the people showed no sign of slowing down, as if time itself had surrendered to their unwavering wakefulness. As night began to settle over the village, the subtle unease that had been creeping into the narrator's mind started to grow heavier, pressing against every sense. Shadows stretched unnaturally long along the stone-paved streets, twisting and bending in ways that made the familiar shapes of the houses and walls seem unfamiliar, almost alive. The warm glow from the windows, which had felt inviting earlier, now took on a softer, stranger quality, like eyes watching, patient and silent. The people he had noticed earlier continued their movements with the same unnerving precision, walking, arranging items, whispering quietly. But now their stillness, their unwavering focus, seemed to mock the natural exhaustion that the narrator could feel dragging his own body down. Every step he took made a small, sharp sound that seemed to echo too clearly in the air, as though the silence itself were listening, measuring, and responding to his presence. The narrator paused for a moment, letting his eyes sweep across the street. A group of children sat on a low wall, their faces turned slightly in his direction. And though they did not move or speak, there was a strange awareness in their gaze, a knowing that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Even the wind seemed hesitant to cross the village, brushing only lightly across the rooftops, never stirring the grass in the fields beyond, as if afraid to disturb the unnatural order that had settled here. The narrator's heartbeat quickened slightly as he felt a pull, almost magnetic, drawing him further into the village, deeper into the stillness that seemed alive and deliberate. He noticed the faint hum again, soft at first, barely audible, threading through the air like a hidden vibration. It was neither music nor noise, but something else entirely, resonating just beneath perception. He couldn't tell if it came from the stones beneath his feet, the houses around him, or from somewhere inside his own mind. The more he focused, the stronger it became, seeping into his chest, pressing against his ribs, and filling his head with a quiet insistence. For the first time, he realized the village was not merely a collection of people. It was a living, watching entity. Every movement, every breath seemed coordinated, synchronized to a rhythm that only the village understood, and he was intruding upon it. As the minutes passed, the narrator felt fatigue pressing down more heavily than ever. His eyelids grew heavy despite the adrenaline in his chest. He wanted to sit, to rest, to close his eyes even for a moment, but an invisible weight held him upright, compelling him to keep moving, to keep observing, to keep awake. It was in that moment he realized this was not a village where people lived normal lives. They did not sleep, and perhaps if he gave in even for a second, the village would claim him too, in a way that no one had ever returned from. The hum pulsed slightly faster, almost impatiently, as if acknowledging his awareness and measuring his willpower. Even as the narrator continued walking through the narrow streets, taking in the unnerving perfection of the scene, the air grew colder, heavier, carrying the faint scent of smoke, earth, and something indefinably old. The houses themselves seemed to lean slightly toward him, not physically, but in a way that made the eye catch the angles differently, making him feel observed from every side. His own breathing became loud in contrast to the perfect stillness of the villagers. Each inhalation and exhalation reminded him painfully of his vulnerability, of how alone he was in his exhaustion. And yet, no one else seemed to notice, as if his struggle were invisible, insignificant to the living rhythm of the village. By the time he reached the small square at the center, where a low stone well sat surrounded by quiet villagers, the full weight of the night pressed upon him. The children on the wall, the adults standing in their precise positions, the faint hum threading through the air, all of it combined into a single, undeniable truth. This village did not sleep, had never slept, and perhaps existed only because of the wakefulness of its inhabitants. The narrator realized he was now fully awake, fully aware, and fully alone in the creeping realization that somewhere, just beyond perception, the village was watching him, patiently, silently, and with infinite attention. The deeper the narrator walked into the village, the more he became aware of an almost imperceptible rhythm that seemed to pulse through the streets themselves, as if the very ground beneath his feet were alive and aware of his presence. The houses, once welcoming in their warm glow, now felt almost predatory, their windows like eyes that followed him with patient scrutiny. He noticed that even the smallest movements of the villagers were synchronized in a way that defied chance, hands folding and unfolding at precisely the same moments, heads tilting in unison, footsteps falling in a pattern too consistent to be natural. Every detail, no matter how ordinary it seemed, carried a weight of intention. The stillness of the night amplified every sound the narrator made. His own heartbeat, the shift of his bag against his shoulder, the faint crunch of stones underfoot, echoing in the heavy, expectant air, as though the village were listening, waiting, gauging his every action. A cold breeze passed through the narrow streets, but it moved oddly, brushing past him without disturbing the leaves or grass beyond the village borders. It was as if the wind itself obeyed some unspoken law here, bending around the village instead of through it. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, stretching and curving along the walls and streets in ways that made familiar shapes appear strange, almost alive. At the edge of his vision, the narrator thought he saw figures that did not belong, shapes moving slightly out of sync with the villagers, dissolving when he turned to look directly at them. The sensation was fleeting, but it sent a shiver down his spine, a subtle warning that there was more here than met the eye. He reached a narrow lane where the houses pressed in closer, their walls leaning slightly, almost imperceptibly, toward the street, creating a corridor of quiet tension. The villagers here were fewer in number, but every movement was precise, deliberate, and deeply unsettling in its calmness. One man carried a bundle of firewood, walking slowly and steadily, yet the narrator felt the man's gaze on him, though the man's eyes never actually moved. Children played quietly near a wall, their heads turning in near-perfect unison whenever he passed, as though the village itself orchestrated their actions. The narrator's chest tightened with the realization that he was being observed constantly, not casually, but with the patient intensity of something that had been doing so for a very long time. As he continued, the faint hum returned, stronger this time, threading through the air like an almost tangible vibration. It wrapped around him, pressing lightly against his temples, his chest, his back, making his every breath feel heavier. He tried to focus on the sound, thinking it might have a source, some mechanical hum, a hidden engine. But the village remained still, silent, unchanged. The sound seemed to exist independently of any visible origin, as if it were part of the village itself, a pulse he could feel more than hear, testing his awareness, his resolve to stay awake, his very presence. The narrator's legs began to ache from the day's travel, and fatigue pressed down with an almost physical weight. He longed to sit, to close his eyes for just a moment, but the pull of a village seemed to hold him upright, forcing him to keep moving, to keep alert, to keep watching. And as the night grew darker, as the lights in the windows glowed brighter against the deepening shadows, he began to understand something terrifying. The village itself was alive, attentive, and awake, and his intrusion had not gone unnoticed. Somewhere in the stillness, in the subtle rhythms of movement and sound, something was aware of him in a way that went beyond observation. The village was waiting, and now he felt it was deciding what to do with him. As the narrator continued through the winding streets, the quiet of the village began to feel heavier, almost oppressive, settling over him like a thick fog that pressed against his chest and dulled his senses. Every footstep echoed unnaturally, bouncing off the stone walls and narrow alleyways, making him hyper-aware of every small noise he made. Somewhere nearby, a door creaked softly, though no one entered or left the house. He turned, expecting to see a villager moving, but the street remained perfectly still, the people frozen in their precise routines. It was as though the village itself had the power to control time within its borders, holding everything in a delicate balance, observing, waiting, and testing his every reaction. The faint hum he had noticed earlier grew louder and more persistent, wrapping itself around him like an invisible thread that pulled at his thoughts, tugged at his attention, and blurred the edges of his awareness. It seemed to rise and fall with a rhythm that was almost hypnotic, drawing him deeper into the streets while simultaneously warning him to be careful, to remain alert, to not let his guard slip. Each house he passed seemed to watch him, the warm light spilling from their windows, now feeling less welcoming and more scrutinizing, judging him for daring to be awake here. Even the shadows seemed alive, stretching along walls, sliding across streets, and slipping just beyond the corner of his eye, only to vanish whenever he tried to focus on them. The villager's movements remained unervingly calm, deliberate, and synchronized, as if every action had been rehearsed. A man bending over to tie his shoes did so with perfect stillness, raising his head for only a brief moment before returning to his task, completely unaware of the narrator's growing unease, or perhaps fully aware and yet indifferent. A child picked up a small stone and turned it over in her hands, inspecting it with meticulous care, before placing it back on the ground exactly where it had been. The narrator's chest tightened as he noticed that these movements were not random. Each one seemed connected to a pattern he could not yet see, as if the village itself was conducting some quiet, precise symphony of wakefulness. Fatigue weighed heavily on him now, and his body threatened to give in. Every muscle in his legs ached. His shoulders sagged. The temptation to sit, to close his eyes even for a moment, was nearly unbearable. Yet each time he considered it, a subtle shift in the air, a movement at the edge of his vision, a fleeting shadow reminded him that to sleep here, even for a second, might have consequences he could not yet imagine. He forced himself to keep moving, his breaths coming in shallow, careful gasps, each step more deliberate than the last, his mind straining to focus on every detail of this unnerving village. And then, for the first time, he sensed it directly. Not a figure, not a sound, but a presence, something unseen, patient, and aware, that seemed to settle on him like a weight, pressing lightly yet insistently on his mind. It was not threatening in a violent way, but it was deliberate, intelligent, and patient, as if measuring his willpower, testing his endurance. The narrator's heartbeat quickened, yet he remained still, observing, trying to understand what it wanted, what it was waiting for. In that moment, the full gravity of the village's secret began to seep into his mind. The people here did not sleep, not because they chose to, but because something in the village demanded it. And the longer he stayed, the more he realized that he, too, would be measured, weighed, and tested by this unseen observer that had quietly marked his presence from the moment he arrived. The narrator felt every step becoming heavier, as if the ground itself had grown dense, pulling at his legs, testing his willpower with each forward movement. The village seemed to shift subtly around him. Walls appeared to bend ever so slightly, the angles of the streets playing tricks on his eyes, making familiar corners feel alien. Shadows grew longer and darker than they had any right to be, pooling at the edges of his vision, stretching and twisting in ways that seemed intentional, deliberate. With every glance, there was a fleeting sense that something was moving just out of focus, a silent observer existing on the edge of perception, teasing him with its presence. He tried to tell himself it was fatigue, a trick of the mind, yet every fiber of his being insisted that it was real. He paused in the center of a small square, near the ancient stone well that had become a landmark in the village. The villagers here remained perfectly still, almost statuesque in their composure. A man leaned slightly over the edge of the well, adjusting something invisible, his motions precise, ritualistic. Children sat on the surrounding stones, their eyes fixed forward, whispering words that made no sense, repeating sounds in unison that seemed to echo in the narrator's chest. The air around him vibrated subtly with the same faint hum that had been threading through the village since his arrival. It felt alive now, pulsating, almost as if the village itself were breathing in rhythm with it. And somehow, it knew he was there. A shiver ran down his spine. His thoughts became sharper, clearer in contrast to the weariness pressing on his body. He realized that the longer he stayed awake, the more acutely he could sense the rhythm of this place, and the more he noticed the unnatural precision of its inhabitants. Every blink, every shuffle, every small sound seemed intentional, purposeful. Even the smallest movements appeared to follow a silent pattern, invisible yet undeniable, a design that had existed long before he arrived. He wondered, with a growing sense of dread, if anyone who had entered this village before him had ever truly understood it, or if they had all simply become part of its quiet order, silent and awake, their presence folded seamlessly into the rhythm of the place. The hum grew louder, not in sound but in pressure, vibrating against his temples, his chest, as if probing his awareness, testing his resistance to exhaustion. He could feel his eyelids growing heavier, his muscles trembling from the day's travel, yet every time he considered stopping, closing his eyes for even a fraction of a second, he felt the village, some invisible, intelligent part of it, responding. The streets seemed to stretch, the shadows thickened, and the ambient hum pulsed slightly faster, coaxing him, warning him. He understood then that to rest, even briefly, could be dangerous. To succumb to sleep in this village was to surrender to it entirely. Despite the overwhelming fatigue, he pressed on, his breathing shallow and uneven. He moved past a row of houses where a woman stood at her doorway, carefully arranging flowers in a pot, her movements meticulous and unhurried, yet unervingly precise. A child played with a small stone, rolling it across the cobblestones in patterns that made no sense but seemed deliberate, as though part of a ritual invisible to the narrator. Each step forward was a test, a challenge. And he could feel it, the watchful weight of the village itself, pressing, probing, measuring his endurance. The air was thick, charged with a quiet energy that made every instinct scream for caution. Yet he was compelled to continue, to see what lay ahead, to remain awake. Hours seemed to stretch into minutes, and the narrator's awareness sharpened even as his body weakened. He noticed that the villager's eyes, unblinking and calm, occasionally flicked toward him in ways that were subtle but deliberate, as if acknowledging his presence without making a sound. The hum pulsed, the shadows shifted, and a faint, almost imperceptible movement at the corner of his vision reminded him that he was not alone in his consciousness. Something, some presence, was aware of him in ways he could not fully comprehend, and it waited, patiently, silently, for him to make his next choice. Finally, as he reached the edge of the square and prepared to continue down another narrow lane, he felt a subtle shift in the air, a quiet, almost imperceptible pressure that suggested the night was far from over. His body screamed for rest, but his mind knew that the real test, the true challenge, was only beginning. Somewhere ahead, deeper within the village, the rhythm of wakefulness, the pulse of the hum, and the watchful eyes of the villagers were converging, preparing to reveal the next layer of the village's secret. With his senses heightened and every nerve alert, he took a cautious step forward, ready to follow the path that the village had silently laid before him. The narrator's journey was far from complete, and the night stretched endlessly ahead. Each step, each shadow, each quiet sound seemed to pull him forward, into the depths of the village's secret. And as the faint hum continued to thread through the air, carrying the weight of centuries of wakefulness, he knew, without knowing exactly why, that the next phase of his ordeal was waiting just beyond the corner. His mind sharpened, his pulse quickened, and he moved onward, ready to confront whatever came next. The narrator stepped cautiously into a narrower lane, leaving behind the small square and the ancient stone well, but the sense of being watched followed him relentlessly, as if the village itself had decided to shadow his every move. The hum, faint yet insistent, threaded through the air like a living presence, pressing lightly against his temples, his chest, even his heartbeat. Every footstep he took felt amplified, echoing against the walls of the tightly packed houses, creating a rhythm that seemed to synchronize with the villagers' subtle movements. Though he was exhausted from a long day of travel, every instinct screamed that he could not stop, could not rest, and could not even blink too long. Even a momentary lapse in awareness seemed dangerous here, as though the village itself was waiting for him to falter, to give in, to be claimed by the unending wakefulness that defined this place. The houses along this lane were smaller, older, their walls warped by centuries of weather, yet their windows glowed with the same unwavering light as before, soft yet strangely focused, like eyes observing without moving. Occasionally, the narrator glimpsed figures behind the glass, adults seated in chairs, children at low tables, but they were not engaged in conversation or activity in any normal sense. Their movements were deliberate and minimal, as though they were preserving energy for something beyond comprehension, or perhaps existing in a reality he could not yet see. Each figure seemed to follow a silent protocol, a rhythm that the narrator could feel but not understand, as if the entire village were operating on a pulse he had yet to decode. He paused for a brief moment near a doorway, hoping to catch a reflection in the glass or a sign of normality, but the faint hum intensified instead, pressing against his awareness in a way that made him shiver. He noticed that even the smallest actions of the villagers, turning a page, adjusting a piece of cloth, lifting a hand to scratch, were synchronized in a way that defied natural randomness. It was not just their wakefulness that unnerved him. It was the precise, orchestrated calmness of their existence. The longer he observed, the heavier the air became, thick with quiet, deliberate attention. Every fiber of his body told him that this was a place where ordinary rules did not apply, a place where sleep itself might be forbidden, dangerous, or perhaps even impossible. Even as fatigue weighed down on him, pressing against his eyelids and dragging at his legs, he continued walking, compelled forward by something he could not name. The village felt alive in a way that went beyond its people. The air, the cobblestones, the faint hum, and the subtle movements of shadows all seemed to exist with a consciousness of their own. Each step brought him deeper into the rhythm, and yet he remained painfully aware that he was an intruder, a temporary participant in a carefully maintained cycle of wakefulness. His mind strained to remain alert, cataloging every detail, every movement, every faint sound, as though understanding the village's secret depended on his ability to notice even the smallest irregularity. And then, in the corner of his vision, he caught a fleeting glimpse of something he could not define, a shadow moving independently of the villagers, shifting slightly against the grain of the soft lamplight. When he tried to focus directly on it, it vanished, leaving only the stillness and the unbroken rhythm of the village. His heart quickened. Every instinct screamed at him that this was only the beginning of what the night had in store, that something unseen was testing his awareness, gauging his reactions, and measuring how long he could remain awake without faltering. The narrator knew, with a deep sinking certainty, that the next hours would not be ordinary, that the village's unblinking attention would stretch across the night, and that he was now fully enmeshed in its strange, relentless rhythm. As the narrator moved further down the narrow lane, the feeling of being observed intensified, pressing against him in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. The villagers' presence was everywhere, yet nowhere. He could feel their attention without seeing them directly. Every small sound he made, the soft shuffle of his boots on the uneven stones, the faint creak of his backpack strap, the quickened rhythm of his heartbeat, seemed amplified in the stillness, as if the very air carried it directly to unseen ears. The hum threading through the village pulsed faintly in tandem with his pulse, almost teasing him, as though the place itself had a consciousness, measuring how long he could stay alert, how long he could resist the natural pull of exhaustion. The houses lining the street appeared older here, their walls warped and uneven, yet the warm, steady glow from the windows remained unchanged, unblinking. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, curling along the walls and spilling across the cobblestones, shifting with the faintest breeze that seemed to obey the village's silent command. Occasionally, the narrator glimpsed figures behind the glass, adults bent slightly over unseen tasks, children sitting perfectly still, every movement meticulous, deliberate, and synchronized in a way that felt orchestrated, almost ritualistic. Even the smallest motions, turning a hand, adjusting a cloth, shifting a foot, followed a pattern that he could not decipher, yet it pressed on his mind with subtle insistence. This village was alive in ways he did not yet understand. The narrator's body groaned with fatigue, his muscles protesting with every step, his eyelids heavy and uncooperative. He longed to pause, to rest, even for a moment, but a quiet tension in the air reminded him that sleep here was not simply discouraged. It felt forbidden. The rhythm of the village seemed to pull him forward, compelling him to continue walking, forcing his awareness to sharpen despite the weariness pressing from every direction. The shadows, the hum, the precision of the villagers' movements, all combined to create a sense that he was trapped within a living organism, a place that existed entirely to observe and test him. A subtle movement at the corner of his vision drew his attention, a figure standing motionless behind a window, perfectly still, yet somehow aware. The narrator blinked, and when he looked again, it was gone, leaving only the soft glow and the deepening shadows. His pulse quickened. Every instinct in his body whispered that the village had layers, secrets hidden beneath the calm surfaces, and that what he had seen was only the first glimpse of its true nature. It was a warning, a test, and perhaps even an invitation, though he did not yet know what it demanded. The narrator's senses sharpened as he forced himself to remain vigilant. Every detail mattered now. The subtle alignment of the villager's posture, the faint flicker of light across a window, the rhythmic hum threading through the streets. He realized that the village existed according to rules he could not yet comprehend, rules designed to challenge those who entered, rules that blurred the line between observer and participant. And as he continued forward, aware of every sound, every shadow, every imperceptible shift in the air, he understood, with growing dread, that this night was only beginning, and the village would not let him rest, not for a single second, as he was drawn deeper into its unending rhythm. As the narrator ventured further into the heart of the village, the stillness around him became almost tangible, pressing in from every side. The faint hum threading through the air seemed to grow stronger, resonating against his chest and temples, vibrating in a way that felt almost alive. It was as if the village itself was conscious of him, aware of every breath he took, every heartbeat, every hesitant step. The shadows, previously simple stretches of darkness, now seemed to move with a will of their own, stretching and curling in impossible ways along the walls and cobblestones. Each flicker of motion at the edge of his vision made his pulse quicken. He felt the weight of eyes upon him that could not be seen, presence that could not be touched, but that was undeniable. Every villager he passed now seemed part of an intricate, unspoken choreography. A man bent slightly to lift a basket of firewood, raising it with fluid precision before placing it down again. A woman swept the doorstep with slow, measured movements, pausing occasionally as though listening for something inaudible. Even children moved with a quiet, eerie synchronicity, their heads tilting in unison whenever he passed. The narrator's mind strained to process it all. The perfection of their actions, combined with their unwavering wakefulness, felt unnatural, deliberate, and almost threatening in its calmness. Every instinct in him screamed that this village was something more than it appeared, something alive and patient, waiting to see how he would endure the night. Fatigue gnawed at him relentlessly. Each step was heavier than the last, his eyelids threatening to close despite every warning from his own mind. Yet the moment he considered rest, a subtle shift in the air, a faint rustle of movement, or the almost imperceptible vibration of the hum snapped his attention back. The village did not allow slowness, weakness, or surrender. Even the faintest lapse seemed to be noticed, measured, weighed. A strange pressure built in his chest, a sensation that his very presence was a test, and that failure, giving in to sleep or distraction, could have consequences far beyond his understanding. He paused for a brief moment near a corner where two narrow alleys converged, trying to catch a glimpse of any normalcy, anything that might give him comfort. Instead, the houses leaned slightly inward as if to watch him, their windows reflecting the soft lamplight in ways that made them appear like unblinking eyes. A faint figure moved behind the glass, a blur of motion so quick and subtle that he almost doubted he had seen it at all. And yet, the instinctual fear that surged through him told him otherwise. The village had noticed him, and something within its quiet order had chosen to make its presence known. The narrator's senses became painfully acute. Every whisper of wind, every faint vibration underfoot, every distant sound, real or imagined, registered in his mind as a potential signal. He felt a cold, creeping certainty that the village's unbroken attention was not benign. It was patient, deliberate, and enduring, capable of waiting for hours, days, or even longer, measuring endurance and willpower with a quiet, unrelenting precision. He realized that the villager's constant wakefulness was not merely habit or ritual. It was survival, a defense, and a warning all at once. And now, he was being drawn fully into it, step by step, his body screaming for rest while his mind struggled to remain alert, fully aware that the night was far from over and that the next phase of the village's test was already beginning. The narrator's legs ached as he moved deeper into the village, each step feeling heavier, weighed down by the thick, almost tangible stillness surrounding him. The faint hum that had been threading through the air since his arrival now pulsed more insistently, wrapping around him like a living force, pressing against his temples and chest with a subtle but undeniable weight. Every sound he made, the soft shuffle of his boots, the faint creak of his backpack, the quickened rhythm of his heartbeat, echoed unnaturally against the walls of the narrow lane, magnified in the still air. It was as if the village itself were listening, measuring, and evaluating him, calibrating each subtle detail of his behavior. The houses along this part of the village were older, closer together, and their walls leaned slightly, creating a sense of claustrophobia. Windows glowed with the same unwavering light, casting long, sharp shadows across the cobblestones. Occasionally, he caught glimpses of villagers inside, adults performing small, meticulous tasks, children sitting perfectly still or whispering in barely audible tones. Their movements were deliberate, synchronized in ways that made his skin crawl, each one perfectly aligned with an invisible rhythm only they could perceive. It was not just that they were awake, it was how they existed, calm, precise, and unnaturally composed, that made his heart race with unease. A faint flicker at the edge of his vision made him spin around instinctively, but there was nothing there. Only the alley, the leaning houses, the glowing windows. And yet, the feeling persisted, that something unseen was aware of him, moving just beyond perception, shifting subtly as he focused on it. The shadows themselves seemed to have weight, stretching unnaturally long along the walls, curling toward him and then receding when he looked directly. Every instinct screamed that the village was alive, not in the way a collection of people is alive, but in a deliberate, intelligent way, with a consciousness that extended through the streets, the stones, the shadows, and even the faint hum that pulsed like a heartbeat. The narrator's exhaustion pressed down mercilessly. His shoulders sagged, his eyelids drooped, his every muscle begged for rest. And yet, each time he considered stopping, closing his eyes even briefly, the subtle, almost imperceptible tension in the air snapped him awake. He felt the village responding to him, testing him, measuring the limits of his endurance. The quiet, synchronized movements of the villagers became almost hypnotic, pulling him forward, drawing him deeper into the heart of the village, and he realized with a shiver that he had no choice but to continue. The closer he moved toward the center of this deeper, narrower lane, the more the village seemed to shift subtly around him, as if bending to his presence, pressing, observing, waiting. The hum pulsed stronger now, a low, insistent vibration threading through his chest and skull, urging him to notice, to understand, to stay awake. Every corner, every shadow, every whisper of movement felt purposeful, intentional, orchestrated to test him, to weigh his attention, and to ensure that he remained vigilant. The narrator's mind strained to stay alert, cataloging every small detail, trying to interpret the rhythm and logic of this place. And then, just as he reached the junction where the lane split into two darker alleys, a fleeting movement at the edge of his vision froze him in place, a shadow, darker than the surrounding darkness, shifting, almost alive, but vanishing the moment he tried to focus directly on it. A chill ran down his spine as he realized that the village's awareness extended beyond the villagers themselves. Something unseen, patient, and intelligent was watching, waiting, assessing him. His pulse quickened, his breaths shallow and deliberate, and he understood with sinking certainty. He was no longer just observing the village. He had become part of its rhythm, ensnared in a web of wakefulness, shadow, and subtle menace. The night stretched on endlessly, yet the lane ahead beckoned, pulling him forward into the unknown. Each step carried him deeper into the village's careful, deliberate design, and he knew, with a quiet dread, that the next phase of the night, the next revelation, the next test, awaited just beyond the corner. And as he moved cautiously forward, alert to every flicker of light, every faint vibration, every subtle shadow, he could not shake the certainty that whatever lay ahead would challenge him in ways he had never imagined, marking the point where the true depth of the village's secret would begin to unfold. The narrator's footsteps echoed softly along the narrow lane, each sound amplified by the heavy stillness that enveloped the village. The hum threading through the air pulsed faintly, wrapping around him like an invisible presence, pressing against his temples and chest with a subtle insistence that made it impossible to ignore. Every shadow seemed alive, shifting ever so slightly with his movements, curling along walls and rooftops, as if the darkness itself were testing his awareness. His heart beat faster, not just from fatigue, but from the growing certainty that something in this village, not a person, not a thing, but the village itself, was observing him patiently, relentlessly. He paused briefly at a corner where two alleys met, feeling the weight of the unseen gaze pressing down on him. The houses lining the street leaned in subtly, their windows glowing like unblinking eyes. Inside, villagers moved with the same deliberate precision he had seen since his arrival, folding cloth, adjusting objects, whispering in low tones. Every motion was synchronized, rehearsed, as if following a rhythm invisible to him. The children played quietly in the corners, their heads turning together, eyes flicking briefly toward him, yet they remained motionless when he attempted to approach. The narrator's exhaustion deepened, every muscle in his body protesting, yet he knew instinctively that he could not pause. Sleep here was forbidden. Even the slightest lapse could make him part of the village's relentless wakefulness. As he continued, a faint movement at the edge of his vision caught his attention, a shadow, darker than the surrounding darkness, moving independently of the villagers. He blinked and it vanished, leaving only the silent, steady rhythm of the village. The hum seemed to grow stronger, pulsing in time with his heart, weaving through the night and threading every stone, every wall, every shadow. The narrator felt a strange pull, as if the village itself were leading him, compelling him forward, deeper into the streets, deeper into the night. Every instinct screamed caution, yet he could not resist the quiet, magnetic rhythm of the place. Fatigue threatened to overcome him, his legs trembling and shoulders sagging with exhaustion, yet his mind remained painfully alert, cataloging every detail. The soft crunch of stones beneath his boots, the faint creak of hinges, the subtle variations in the hum, all of it mattered. He could feel the villagers' attention like a weight pressing against him, measuring his endurance, testing how long he could resist, how long he could remain fully aware. The night stretched endlessly, each shadow, each flicker of movement, each breath, reminding him that this village was not ordinary. Its silence, its wakefulness, its unblinking observation were designed to trap and test anyone who entered. Finally, as the lane opened into a wider courtyard, the narrator realized he had reached another threshold, the next layer of the village's secret. The shadows deepened, the hum pulsed stronger, and every sense told him that the most intense part of his journey, the phase that would truly test his mind, body, and awareness, was about to begin. His pulse quickened, his body remained tense, and he understood with quiet dread that what lay ahead would push him beyond mere observation into confrontation with the village's unseen forces. With careful, deliberate steps, he moved forward, ready to enter the next phase, and at that moment, as the narrator stepped into the wider courtyard, the weight of the village's presence pressed down on him more heavily than ever. The faint hum threading through the night air seemed to thrum against his chest, rising and falling like a living heartbeat that echoed his own. Shadows danced along the stone walls in ways that defied logic, twisting and curling as if they had minds of their own. The villagers who had appeared so calm and precise before now seemed even more deliberate in their actions, moving with a measured rhythm that made every movement feel rehearsed, purposeful, and unerringly deliberate. Their unblinking eyes followed him, yet none spoke, none acknowledged him directly, and this silence was far more terrifying than any sound could have been. The narrator's senses heightened to an almost unbearable degree. He could hear the faintest creaks of floorboards, the subtle scrape of stones under boots, the soft rustle of clothes against skin. Every small detail of the village seemed amplified, charged with a tension that made it impossible to relax even for a moment. He noticed that the villagers' shadows stretched unnaturally long across the courtyard, merging with the darkness of the walls and cobblestones, forming shapes that appeared to move independently of their owners. A sudden chill ran down his spine as he realized these shadows were not entirely connected to the bodies casting them. They twisted, shifted, and lingered with a subtle intelligence that felt conscious, aware, and patient. Fatigue tugged at him relentlessly, each muscle in his body aching from the long night, yet his mind refused to succumb. Every instinct screamed that the village demanded his full awareness, that even a second of lapse could have consequences beyond comprehension. The hum pulsed louder, vibrating through the air and threading through the narrator's chest and skull, forcing him to focus, to remain vigilant, to observe without faltering. He could feel it now, not just the villagers' attention, but something else, something invisible that had been silently following him since his arrival, assessing, testing, and calculating. The presence was patient, quiet, almost respectful, yet undeniably powerful. He moved carefully across the courtyard, taking note of every detail. The uneven stones beneath his feet, the leaning walls of the surrounding houses, the subtle flickers of lamplight in the windows, all carried a weight, a deliberate meaning that he could not yet interpret. Occasionally, a child would glance his way, eyes calm and unblinking, as though seeing him not as a visitor, but as part of a larger design, a pattern that stretched beyond comprehension. Adults moved with quiet, hypnotic precision, performing mundane tasks with a deliberate patience that both fascinated and terrified him. He realized that every corner, every shadow, every sound, even the faint hum itself, was part of a carefully orchestrated system, one that existed not only to observe, but to test, to weigh, and to measure the endurance of anyone who dared to enter. The courtyard itself seemed to breathe with a subtle rhythm, expanding and contracting with the unseen pulse of the village. The air carried a faint, earthy scent, tinged with smoke and something older, indefinable, a fragrance that hinted at centuries of secrets hidden within the walls and stones. As he moved forward, the hum threaded through his awareness like a whispered mantra, forcing him to remain alert, reminding him of the relentless watchfulness that surrounded him. He felt the village's consciousness in every step, every flicker of light, every soft rustle, and a quiet fear settled in his chest, fear not of violence or harm, but of the unknown, of the patient, deliberate, and unyielding presence that seemed to govern this place. By the time he reached the center of the courtyard, near a low, crumbling fountain that had long since stopped flowing, the narrator felt the full weight of his isolation. No sound came from beyond the village walls, no wind stirred the branches above, and yet the space felt alive, aware, and attentive in a way that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. He understood, with a clarity that made his pulse race, that he was being tested, measured, and evaluated by a force far beyond the ordinary, and that the next phase of the night, the deeper revelations of this village's secrets, was about to begin. Every nerve in his body screamed for caution, every instinct demanded vigilance, yet a part of him was compelled forward, drawn into the rhythm, the pulse, and the silent intelligence that governed this strange, unblinking world. The narrator hesitated for a moment, taking in the expanse of a courtyard, and realized that the silence itself seemed to weigh on him, pressing against his chest like a living thing. Every subtle sound, the faint shift of a stone underfoot, the whisper of wind that never fully moved the leaves, the soft hum threading through the village, became amplified, intrusive, impossible to ignore. Shadows stretched across the courtyard, bending along walls and ground in ways that felt unnatural, almost sentient. He noticed, with a growing unease, that they did not always align with the villagers' forms. Sometimes they lingered behind, separated from their sources, twisting as though hinting at a presence beyond comprehension. As he moved forward, the villagers continued their quiet, deliberate routines, their actions synchronized in ways that defied natural movement. A man adjusting a bundle of firewood did so with a precision that seemed rehearsed, yet his gaze briefly flicked toward the narrator, sharp and deliberate, before returning to the task. A woman folded cloth with slow measured motions, pausing as though listening for an inaudible sound. Children sat perfectly still at the corners, whispering faintly in low tones that made the narrator's chest tighten, their voices harmonizing in eerie, subtle rhythms he could not identify. Every movement was purposeful, and the air seemed to vibrate with a silent intelligence, aware of him, measuring him, pressing him toward alertness he could hardly sustain. Fatigue gnawed at him relentlessly. Each muscle ached, every joint protested, and his eyelids threatened to close despite the adrenaline sharpening his senses. He longed for a moment of rest, yet each time he considered it, the weight of the village's awareness bore down, and he felt the faint pressure of observation tighten like invisible hands, urging him forward. The hum intensified, pulsing in tandem with his heart, threading through his bones, through the stones beneath his feet, through every shadow that twisted along the walls. It was a rhythm he could feel more than hear, a subtle reminder that sleep, even for a second, could mean surrender, absorption, or worse, in a place that did not forgive weakness. A sudden flicker in the corner of his vision made him spin instinctively. A shadow detached itself from a wall, moving independently for just a moment before melting back into the darkness. His pulse quickened as he realized this village existed on multiple planes, some perceptible, some invisible, each layer attentive and deliberate. He could feel it observing him, testing him, forcing him to remain vigilant, to catalog every subtle shift, every faint sound, every movement that might hint at the underlying truth. The village's stillness was not passive. It was alive, deliberate, and infinitely patient, extending through walls, windows, streets, and the faint vibration in the air, creating a web of awareness from which there was no casual escape. The courtyard stretched ahead, wider and more shadowed than any lane before, leading toward areas the narrator had yet to explore. Every step drew him deeper into the rhythm, deeper into the pulse, and he understood that the next phase, the next layer of secrets, of careful observation, of unyielding wakefulness, awaited just beyond this space. The night pressed down heavier, and every instinct told him that nothing he had seen so far compared to what lay ahead. And as he took a careful, deliberate step forward, he felt the subtle shift of unseen forces guiding him. As the narrator pressed onward, the courtyard seemed to stretch endlessly, the shadows lengthening unnaturally, curling and twisting around walls and cobblestones with a quiet, deliberate intent. The faint hum threading through the village now pulsed more insistently, resonating against his chest and skull like a living rhythm that he could not escape. Every step he took felt heavier, more deliberate, as though the very ground were testing his endurance, pressing against him, making sure he remained fully alert. He could feel the weight of the villagers' attention everywhere, watching, measuring, patiently waiting for him to make a misstep, a lapse in awareness, a single moment of fatigue. The villagers' movements were hypnotic in their precision, almost ritualistic, yet their eyes, unblinking and calm, betrayed an awareness beyond human comprehension. A man bent slightly to adjust a bundle of sticks, pausing mid-motion to glance briefly toward the narrator, a subtle acknowledgement that sent a chill down his spine. Children sat at the edge of the courtyard, whispering faintly in tones that harmonized in eerie, unidentifiable patterns, their voices threading into the persistent hum of the night. Even the smallest motions, the flick of a hand, the tilt of a head, the shift of weight, felt purposeful, as if each were part of an intricate, unseen design. The narrator realized with growing dread that he was not merely observing. He had become part of this web, this careful, deliberate system of awareness and measurement. Fatigue clawed at him relentlessly. Every muscle screamed, his legs wobbled, and his eyelids threatened to close despite the fear sharpening his senses. Yet each time he considered pausing, a subtle, almost imperceptible pressure in the air reminded him that sleep or inattention here was impossible. The village's awareness, patient and unyielding, seemed to extend beyond the people themselves, through the shadows, the walls, the cobblestones, and the faint hum threading the air. It pressed lightly but insistently against his consciousness, reminding him that he was being observed, tested, and measured in ways that went far beyond the ordinary. A flicker at the edge of his vision caught his attention. A shadow, darker than the surrounding darkness, detached itself from a nearby wall, moving with quiet intelligence before dissolving back into the gloom. The narrator's heart raced as he realized this village operated on layers, some perceptible, some hidden, all attentive. The hum intensified, pulsing in tandem with his heartbeat, vibrating through every fiber of his body. He felt the village's rhythm aligning with his own awareness, testing his endurance, and forcing him to remain fully alert. Every sense screamed that the night had only just begun, and that the most intense revelations of the village's secrets were still ahead. Steeling himself against the growing dread, the narrator pressed on, stepping carefully over uneven cobblestones, watching the shadows, noting every subtle flicker of movement, every whisper in the air. The courtyard seemed to lead him deeper, to a place where the line between the visible and the invisible blurred, where the village's secrets would slowly reveal themselves to him. He knew with a rising tension that he had no choice but to continue, that the night would not relent, and that the next phase, the one that would truly test him, was waiting just beyond the next shadow. The narrator's steps echoed softly through the courtyard, yet the silence around him felt alive, almost sentient, pressing in on every side. Each shadow stretched and shifted with a slow, deliberate motion that made him question whether they were simply reflections of the villagers or something more, something conscious, moving independently of the physical world. The faint hum that had accompanied him throughout the night now pulsed with a subtle intensity, vibrating in sync with his heartbeat, threading through the stones beneath his feet and wrapping around his chest like an invisible, patient force. Every step felt heavier than the last, not due to fatigue alone, but as if the village itself were testing his endurance, measuring the limits of his awareness. He noticed that the villagers' movements had grown more ritualistic and synchronized, almost as if they were performing for the village itself rather than any observer. A man carefully adjusted a stack of wood, pausing mid-motion as if to check the alignment, his gaze flicking briefly toward the narrator before returning to the task. A woman bent over a small hearth, methodically arranging ashes and embers, her hands moving with meticulous precision. Children whispered softly in corners, their voices threading into the subtle hum of the night, blending seamlessly with the rhythm that seemed to pulse through every inch of the village. Each small motion carried weight, intention, and purpose, reinforcing the idea that nothing here was random, and everything was part of a deliberate, unseen design. Fatigue pressed upon the narrator like a living force, his muscles aching, his eyelids heavy, yet he dared not slow his steps. Even the smallest lapse in attention felt impossible, as if the village could sense every wavering thought, every distracted glance, every heartbeat that faltered. The shadows seemed to grow longer, darker, and more animated, curling around corners and stretching across walls in ways that made him question his own perception. Something in the air, subtle, almost imperceptible, reminded him that the village's awareness extended beyond its inhabitants, inhabiting every stone, every crack in the walls, every flicker of lamplight, patiently watching, waiting, and evaluating him. As he moved cautiously toward the edge of a courtyard, he sensed a faint shift in the rhythm of the hum, almost like a signal, a subtle cue that something beyond the visible was about to reveal itself. The village seemed to breathe around him, inhaling and exhaling with the pulse of an unseen consciousness, and every instinct in his body screamed that the night's true challenge was approaching. He felt drawn deeper, compelled forward by a force he could neither see nor understand, each step a test of endurance, courage, and awareness. The courtyard stretched ahead, a silent labyrinth of shadows, lights, and subtle movements, and the narrator knew that the next phase of the night. The narrator stood motionless in the heart of the village, the soft hum that had threaded through the night now pulsing like a living heartbeat, wrapping around him, pressing lightly yet insistently against his chest, his mind, and his very bones. Shadows twisted and curled along the uneven cobblestones and the leaning walls of ancient houses, moving independently of their sources, alive with a presence he could neither see nor fully comprehend. The villagers' unblinking eyes seemed to pierce him from every direction, their precise, measured movements resuming as if nothing had changed, yet everything felt charged with an invisible awareness, an intelligence that extended beyond their bodies, through the very streets, the stones, the air itself. Each breath he took felt heavier, each heartbeat louder, sinking to the rhythm of the village in ways both terrifying and mesmerizing. Time here no longer felt linear. The night stretched and folded upon itself, shadows lengthening into impossible forms, and the hum threading through the air pulsed in tandem with his own rising panic and awe. Every sound, the faint scrape of a footstep, the whisper of a fabric, the subtle creak of a door, seemed amplified, imbued with meaning he could not decode, yet could feel deep in his chest. The narrator realized, with a mix of fear and reverence, that he was no longer an intruder merely observing. He had become an integral part of the village's eternal rhythm. The realization was both freeing and suffocating. Sleep, rest, and freedom were no longer options. He existed within a world that demanded awareness, vigilance, and participation, where the quiet, deliberate presence of the village measured his every thought and movement. He looked around, taking in the courtyard, the narrow alleys, the leaning houses, the dim lights spilling from every window. The villagers moved with the same hypnotic precision, yet there was now a subtle acknowledgment in their posture, a recognition that he had endured the night, survived its tests, and become part of its hidden pattern. Even the shadows seemed to watch him differently, less threatening, yet no less alive. The hum resonated in perfect harmony with his own pulse, as though the village had claimed him, not with malice, but with a patience that stretched across centuries, folding him into its history, its secrets, and its eternal wakefulness. A chill ran down his spine as he realized the full weight of what this meant. He would never truly leave. Every thought, every memory, every movement would now be measured, observed, and recorded in the unblinking eyes of the village. Yet alongside the terror was a strange, hypnotic calm, a sense of belonging within the unending rhythm, the pulse of the night, and the subtle intelligence that governed the streets, the shadows, and the faint, omnipresent hum. He understood that this was not punishment, but an inevitable truth of a place that existed beyond comprehension, a living organism of patience, awareness, and quiet power. The night pressed down one final time, heavy and infinite, stretching the shadows to impossibly long forms, and the village seemed to breathe around him, inhaling and exhaling with a slow, deliberate rhythm of eternity. He felt the hum vibrate through every fiber of his being, threading together his mind, body, and awareness into the pulse of the village itself. As the first faint light of dawn kissed the horizon, it did not bring relief, only the realization that some places never release those who enter. They transform them, entwine them, and fold them into their unending story. The narrator exhaled slowly, fully aware of his fate, yet strangely at peace with the knowledge that he had become part of something far older, wiser, and infinitely patient. And in that final moment, as the shadows merged with the morning light, the hum settled into a soft, eternal cadence, leaving the narrator fully immersed, fully awake, and forever bound to the pulse, the unblinking eyes, and the secretive, watchful heartbeat of the village that never sleeps. The story ended, yet in truth it had only become eternal, existing now not just in memory, but in every step, every shadow, and every breath within the quiet, patient rhythm of the village itself.